Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Howdy everybody. Today I'm going to be painting a squad of Space Marine Eliminators. I got a commission to do some Space Wolves, and I don't normally do Space Wolves. So I started off by priming it with Army Painter Black. I find it works just fine for everything I need, and it's a little cheaper than GW's Chaos Black, so that's my go-to. Now I'm going to be using my airbrush here. The person who gave me the commission, they said they wanted it to have really smooth but still very defined color transitions, and I'm not that good at wet blending. So I'm going to use my airbrush. So what I do here is, when I put on the first layer of paint, I don't cover all the black. I intentionally leave the parts of the armor, the parts of the model that are facing directly down towards the base. Leave those, or the inner parts, so you can see the inside of his leg, underneath his arm. Don't spray those. Instead, you're going to want to do 2 coats, because air paints are very thin, and that's how you build up color. You don't just sit there and keep blasting it in one spot, or you'll start to see it run. Instead, put a thin layer around it, let it dry, put another thin layer around it, and eventually you'll build up that color. It's almost like doing dry brushing, but slightly different. So after a couple coats, putting on this base color and letting that dry, I move on to the first highlight. Now what I do here is, I now just spray the areas that are almost facing straight up. I'm not pretending that the light is shining directly down like you see the camera angle, but whereas the base coat I probably painted at about a 45-degree angle, now it's probably closer to, say, 60-70 degrees, so that I only get the top parts. So notice on the leg I'm just getting his toe. On the power pack I just get a tiny spritz on the top of the little bulb there. On his armor I just get the very top of the armor. Otherwise you're going to cover everything, and then there's no point in having that first layer of paint. You can see here another coat on the feet, just the toes, and a little bit on the knee because the knee is sticking out, but the rest of the leg I'm going to leave it because that's going to be in the shadow, so it would be a slightly darker color. Now for the very last highlight, I'm using Fenrisian Gray. And this, you want to be super sparing. In fact, I don't even know if you can see the color that's going on here, but you just want to get the very tips. And then after we're done with this base coating with the airbrush, we will use the Fenrisian Gray again to get some sharp highlights. But you can see there really nice blending and fading. I could never do that with a brush, so I got to use an airbrush for that. Okay, now that the model's totally dry, you can see a little better there how the blending's going to work. We're now going to do, again, what I like to call the pinstripe or pin detailing. We're not going to wash the whole thing. That would destroy everything. Instead, we're just going to get a very fine tip brush, and we're going to put some Agrax Earthshade just in the most recessed crevices, cracks, joints between the armor, everything that you can see me painting here. We're wanting to create some contrast because the airbrush will flow into all of those little nooks and crannies. And here you can see just the difference between the 2 feet, what this little bit of wash, applying a wash, does to the model. So be very careful, because if you make any mistakes, you're going to have to re-airbrush, and that nobody wants to do that once you're done. So take your time, make sure you do it right, be very careful, and make sure you don't have too much wash on your brush. Now, as I mentioned previously, we are going to come back with the Fenrisian Gray and do some very edge highlighting. And what's odd is, this is the same gray that we finished off with, but notice because the airbrush puts it on so thin, you can use it again, brushed on as a highlight, and it still sticks out. Technically, those are the same colors I'm painting on top of each other, but they still stand out. So just very toes, edges of armor, just sharpest parts that you really want to stick out, almost as if the sun is glinting off of them. Okay, so the armor's done. Now, usually for a Space Marine, that means 95% of the model's done, but in this case, no, because they've got that cloak and all that other cloth they're wearing on it. So although the armor's done, this model's still far from being finished. So now get your favorite black. I like using that Vallejo black because it's a very flat black. It seems to coat a little better. I know when I paint with Abaddon black from GW, I gotta put 2 or 3 layers on before it looks good. Now, I will say though, the Vallejo seems to rub off or chip off a little more easily. So I kind of keep both with me. At the very least, I would use this black as a base, and then the Abaddon black over top if you're so inclined, to give it a little more shine to it, because this black dries very, very flat. But still, it's up to you, some kind of a black. Since I'm painting this like the box art, so we get the leather straps, we get his knee pad, we get any of the joints in the armor. A lot of the stuff you normally would paint is on the back side of the model, like behind the knees, so we don't have to worry about that because that cloak is in the way. But we get those pieces on his armor, and then we'll also paint over the majority of the weapon because that also has a black base coat. So now that we got the black areas of the model, particularly the weapon, based in, let's now do the metallic ones. Now while I'm painting this, one thing that I would highly recommend that I see a lot of new painters do is they hold the model in place and move their hand. Your painting hand should stay in the same position, and you move the model, just like here. I turned him upside down so that I'm still holding that brush in the same place and always pulling with those soft, easy down strokes. You start trying to crook and twist and bend your arm, you're going to make more mistakes because you lose control. Whereas the model doesn't care what position it's in or whether or not it's upside down. Make sure your painting hand is comfortable, is controlled, and put the model in whatever position it needs to be for you to be able to paint with your hand in that most comfortable and controlled position. Got a little bit of a swipe there of metallic, but that's okay. We'll neat that up when we do edging. Okay, so now that we've got the 2 base colors of the weapon down, let's finish off the gun entirely. So when I'm doing the casings around a weapon, the black part here, I have 2 different methods I like to use, or rather 2 different color schemes. One is a gray gunmetal and the other is a blue. I tend to like the blue one. I think it looks a little nicer, but because the model is so blue already, I'm going to use the gray this time. So this is my go-to gray highlighting scheme. You got your basic black, whether that's Abaddon black or flat black, whatever, just whatever black you use. Eshin gray is your first highlight, and then Dawnstone is your second. So with the Eshin gray, or with your intermediate gray tone, basically outline the entire model. Everything. Every edge, every corner, everything. Pretend you're back in 3rd grade and you're tracing something. Trace every single edge of the model with this Eshin gray. It'll help to separate the different areas. It'll make the gun look more distinct rather than being this solid black mass. And now that we've got that mid-tone gray, now we come in with the highlight gray. Like I said, I like to use Dawnstone. When we're highlighting this time, we're just going to do top edges. So along the very top of the weapon, anywhere where there's a horizontal line. If the model is standing on its base, anything that's horizontal is definitely going to get painted. Maybe some vertical, like down the very front of the gun. But other than that, just horizontal lines. It will help distinguish even further the lighter gray from the black, from the darker gray. And as you can see, it makes the rifle really, really stick out. We are just about finished with the weapon here. Get your favorite gold-ish. I wouldn't use gold itself. Get a brass, get a bronze. You could use silver again. There's a couple buckles on the strap here of the rifle. So paint that in whatever metallic color you prefer. Just don't use something super bright like gold, unless that somehow jives with the rest of the model. Now, with the exception of the cloak he's wearing, we're pretty much just down to details. So next, let's tackle the purity seal that he's got up front there. Now, there's a billion and one ways to do parchment. I like experimenting with different ones. In this case, I'm going to use a fairly bright white as my base coat. And then I'm going to come back over it with a sepia wash to turn it from a bright white into more of a parchment color. I find it very simple, very quick. Now, the white that I painted on that parchment was still a little bit wet, so I'm waiting for it to dry. We'll go back to the rifle and put on a very, very light layer of Nuln Oil just to help separate some of the details with the metallic. We've already taken care of the casing of the rifle, but we need to add some depth to the metal. So just do a nice, quick, thin layer of Nuln Oil. Then you can come back and highlight with a silver, and you're good. Okay, now we get our gold. This is the reason I said not to do the buckles on the straps in gold, is because there are a few details on the model that are in gold, such as the top of the purity seal here, the little skulls on his ammo pouches, which I painted, by the way, when I did the gun. I did the exact same scheme on those ammo pouches on his leg there. But there's a skull. Each of those is going to get a little dab of gold. And then on the rifle itself on the side, there's another skull that gets a bit of gold. Those are meant to be very ornamental, and you don't want to make those the same color as the buckles. That's why I use bronze for the buckles and then gold for the details. Now, normally I put helmets on all my Space Marines. I just never understood why you'd go into battle with your head exposed, especially when you're having things like bolt shells being shot at you. But in this case, the model has to be built this specific way. So there is a little flesh on him. I use the exact same methods for fair skin flesh with pretty much every single model. Start with Bugman's Glow, then move on to Cadian Flesh Tone, and then highlight with Kislev Flesh. So there's not too much here. Try not to get any on the mask on the front. It's a small enough detail that if you do go over, you won't need to get the airbrush out, but it's just better not to have to neat that up in the first place. Now, when I come back here to do the goggles he's on, the night vision goggles, I didn't do it initially when I did the black because I wasn't sure if I wanted to do it silver or if I wanted to do them black. I was focusing just on the weapon. The head, to me, was an entirely separate part, and when I looked back and noticed, oh, they wanted it in black, okay. So you could have done it when you did it with the others. You just have to be a little more careful when you're painting the flesh that you don't accidentally, get some skin color on the goggles. But either way, you can do them silver, black, whatever color works with your scheme. This model, because he's a sergeant, there needs to be something to separate him from the other two. Normally the whole helmet is red, but he's not wearing a helmet, and I didn't want to do red goggles. So instead, I looked on the box, and what they do is this little side piece where the goggles connect to the gorget, or the main part of the armor around his neck. They have that painted red. So I didn't want a really bright red. That's why I didn't use Mephiston red. These guys are supposed to be snipers, so you don't want stuff like sticking out. So grabbed myself corn red or a darker muted red, painted those sides. Now you know which model's your sergeant. So now let's go back and finish off the skin. You could add a layer of flesh tone if you want, but there's not that much showing, so I'm just going to go instead with taking a thin layer of the Cadian flesh tone and just not painting over the entirety of the Bugman's Glow. Just leave the area around the edge, recessed areas like you can see here when I'm doing the sides of his head. You don't paint the whole thing, and the Bugman's Glow will become your shade, and you don't need to put in any kind of liquid shade or anything like that. So at this point I finally remembered that I actually had that parchment down by his waist. So I grabbed some sepia, because that has more of a ancient weathered look to it. Earthshade would just make it look like dirty paper. I just want it to look more like old paper. Put a layer of sepia on it, and boom, you've got yourself a beautiful kind of golden tea colored piece of parchment. let's go back now that the Nuln Oil on the weapon has finally dried. Get yourself a brighter silver. Ironbreaker's good. Runefang Steel or Stormhost Silver, whichever one it is, might be a little too much here. But grab a brighter steel, and kind of like what you did with the casing of the weapon, highlight just the top areas. So on that circle there, just the top part, not the whole thing, and it makes the metal stick out. We're just about done with the head. We got to paint this guy's hair. And since the Space Wolves are Space Vikings, obviously a whole bunch of them are going to be blonde. So that's what I'm going to do with this guy. Now, my kind of go-to color scheme for blonde is to start with a Xandri Dust as your base. Now, it looks pretty good as it is, but you still need at least one layer of highlight in there just to give it the illusion of hair and strands and stuff like that. So Xandri Dust as your first base. And then for the highlight, something brighter like Ushabti Bone, and you stipple it, or you brush it in very short, very kind of quick strokes, because you don't want to paint over it. Being able to see the Ushabti Bone and the Xandri Dust gives it the illusion of strands of hair. My apologies on this part, I neglected to film the base coating. So on the shoulder pad, I used Averland Sunset. You're gonna need a couple coats. Yellow is notoriously difficult to work with in the first place, and putting it over a darker color makes it even worse. So just take your time, a couple coats, and then we can move on. Now, we get here to the cape. This is gonna be probably the most important part of the model, because it's what really sets these models apart from other Space Marine models, is this camo cloak that they're wearing. Now, because it's a winter scheme, I need it to be a base coat of white, but I don't want to start with a bright white like ceramite white, because then there's nowhere to highlight from there. So Celestra Gray I find to be a fantastic starting point. It's very difficult to shade white, but you can highlight it. So if you start with something like ceramite white here, it's white, but it's a kind of a grayish white. And so it's easier to build up color from here than to try and darken down something that's super bright like ceramite. You're definitely going to need a couple coats of this. Take your time, especially when you get to the edges where the cloth meets some of the armor. What I found when I was doing these is I painted one of the cloaks, and then put that model down, picked up one of the others. By the time I had finished the third model in the set, the first one was dry, went back, did another coat over it, and it actually only took 2 coats before this guy was more or less finished. Now that we got that base coat of Celestra Gray down, now we're going to highlight it up to the level we actually want. So Ulthuan Gray, I think, is closer to what you imagine for a white of a winter cloak. So we're going to paint over the majority of the cloak with this. Now, I know you're going to feel like, why did I put 2 coats on just to paint over it again? That's because if you don't, the cloak will look blotchy, and you don't want that. So paint over all of the raised areas. In fact, assume you're going to paint over the entire cloak except for the spots where the cloak sinks inwards, like you can see here. Also, around the bottom where you see the trim where the 2 cloaks kind of overlap each other, don't paint right up to the line of that cloak that's on top, and that will again give this illusion of shadow and depth. Once you finish with the first one, put it aside to dry, paint the others. When you're done with the last one, the first one will be dry, because you are definitely going to need 2, possibly 3 coats to get this to the level of consistency and coverage that you're looking for, most likely. You may like the blotchy look to it. Again, the only person who has to be happy with the paint scheme is you. Unless you're doing a commission, obviously, then the other person has to be happy. But it's done when you're happy with it. With the white just about done, I'm waiting for it to dry. I'm going to put 1 small layer of Zamisi Desert here on the shoulder pad. What's weird is the Misi Desert is almost the exact same color as Averland Sunset, but it's a layer paint, it's a lot smoother, it covers nicer, and what I find it does is it lightens up the yellow just a bit, gives it a very smooth, beautiful finish, and it's a lot easier to work with than Averland Sunset. You don't have to do it, it's just my preference. So now with our last layer of white on the cloak, we're going to kind of do the opposite of what we did the first time. The first time, we wanted to cover all of the cloak except for the most recessed areas. Now we're going to use the white scar and just paint the most raised areas. So there's not a whole lot to do. In fact, if you notice here, the amount of darker white, of that light gray you can see, is about how much of the super bright white scar you're going to see. This is just to again separate the lightest areas from the darkest areas and give the cloak a little bit more depth and personality so it doesn't just look like one solid color. Alright, we're getting close to the end here. Just a few things left. Go back to your favorite black. Again, I like to use Vallejo's black, but whichever one works best for you. And just very carefully paint the raised edge of the shoulder pad here. I know sometimes I say I like to paint the edge first and then the area underneath. In this case, I did it the other way. You're going to find which way to paint that works best for you. But just get the trim here. And you'll notice as soon as you get that, suddenly that yellow that you painted on the shoulder pad will really, really pop because it's got this very dark black that it's put up right next to. Okay, one thing left, and it's the tricky part. The person who gave me this model to paint wanted not just a white winter cloak, but winter camo. And they sent me this picture here as an example of what the finished product should look like. So I figured after staring at it long and hard, the best thing to do would be various layers of Nuln Oil, because the Nuln Oil goes on pretty light, and I think that would be more like the mid-tone. So I got myself an older brush with some kind of curled bristles on the edge, and I'm not going for strong sweeping strokes. Instead, I'm almost like tapping as I slowly carry it across the model. And that gives it kind of a bit of a random pattern. And you'll notice in some places, depending on how much ink I have on the brush, it'll pool. And in other places it won't. And it gives me that initial contrast. Because you can see in the pattern there in the top right, within the same patch, there'll be some lighter and darker areas. So I'm going to go over it this first time and just kind of block out where I want the different squiggles and shapes and things like that. But then we'll go back over. Some of them will repaint so that there's an even darker area. So at this point, I'm going to go back, and as you'll see, some of the areas that I've already applied some of that wash, I'm going to go back and apply it again, but not over the entire shape, just over part of it, to try and again create this difference of tones within the same patch and create that camouflage effect. Camouflage is very difficult to do without an airbrush, or when it's in super detailed areas like this. So this is what I came up with. Now, if any of you have a method of doing it that works just as well and it's faster, easier, or gives a nice, better look to it, let me know. I'm always interested in adding new ideas and techniques to my repertoire. So just about finished, but I was looking at the cloak and thought, there's still something missing. We need really, really light shades to kind of break up the dark ones and then the super bright white patches as well. So I did a 50-50 mix of Lamian medium and Nuln Oil. And you'll see here it's so light you almost can't see it, but that will work to continue to break up the large patches of the cloak and give it a much more camo approach. So I just dabbed on stuff, as you can see here, and let it dry where it dried. I didn't go back and add another layer. Instead, this was just to try and separate those remaining spots where you had maybe a little too much of the white going together. One last finishing touch, although not really finishing touch, a quick layer of a gray. Grab any gray. I'm going to end up basing this with some gravel, but I wanted to make sure that the base had at least a basic coat of gray so that I don't have to push the texture paint too close to the foot of the model and risk getting some of the texture paint on the foot. So this is just a quick layer, kind of like a prepping for basing the model. And there he is, all finished. I haven't put the transfer on the shoulder pad yet, but as far as painting, that is all I'm going to do. So let me know what you think. Again, if you have any other ideas for the camo cloak, please let me know. It's not perfect, but I think it's good enough.